She stood there, silent and steady, while the words sliced through the pristine air like shards of glass. "How dare you come to work wearing those pathetic shoes? You look like you crawled out of a homeless shelter." The voice belonged to Victoria Ashford, 24 years old and dripping with the kind of cruelty that only immense wealth can nurture. The maid bowed her head, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she clutched the cleaning supplies closer to her chest. Those worn leather shoes, with their cracked surfaces and paper-thin soles, whispered stories of countless miles walked, of dignity preserved despite poverty, of a strength that no designer heel could ever contain. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're washing dishes in a kitchen that isn't yours, folding laundry for a family that barely acknowledges your existence, or riding the bus home after another 14-hour day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you, and perhaps it will change something inside you, as it did for those who lived it. This is the story of Maria Elena Vasquez, a woman who carried invisible burdens and extraordinary grace. She worked as a housekeeper in a gleaming penthouse that crowned one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings on the Upper East Side, where luxury lived behind marble facades and bulletproof windows, and where human warmth was often as rare as a genuine smile. The penthouse belonged to Richard Ashford III, a man who had built a financial empire worth over $2 billion through strategic investments in technology stocks, cryptocurrency portfolios that included substantial Bitcoin holdings, and real estate assets spanning 3 continents. But wealth had not shielded him from the devastating blow of losing his wife Margaret to cancer 2 years prior, leaving him emotionally bankrupt despite his overflowing bank accounts. Victoria, his only daughter, had inherited her father's ruthless business acumen, but none of his capacity for human connection. She treated Maria and the entire household staff like expensive furniture, useful when needed, invisible when not. Money, she believed, bought not just comfort, but the right to look down on those who served her. Every interaction was a transaction, every kindness a weakness she couldn't afford to show. Maria's journey began each morning in Washington Heights, a vibrant neighborhood where Dominican salsa mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from corner bakeries and where families stretched every dollar like elastic. Her small apartment on 181st Street overlooked a courtyard where children played soccer with makeshift goals and grandmothers gossiped in rapid Spanish while hanging laundry on fire escape lines. The subway ride from the A train to the 6 train took an hour and 15 minutes, but Maria used that time to pray, to gather her strength for another day of navigating the emotional minefield of the Ashford household. Her hands, marked by years of cleaning chemicals and hard labor, told stories of a fractured past. 22 years ago, she had arrived from El Salvador with nothing but hope and a second-grade education, fleeing a civil war that had claimed her husband and left her widowed at 26 with 2 young children. The early years in New York had been a blur of factory jobs, night shifts, and sleeping on relatives' couches while she saved every penny to bring stability to her family. Her son Miguel was now a paramedic in Brooklyn, married with children of his own, while her daughter Carmen taught elementary school in Queens. Maria's scarred fingers had folded countless dollars into envelopes marked Miguel's college fund and Carmen's books, sacrificing her own dreams so her children could build better lives. The weight of generational poverty sat heavy on her shoulders, but it had also forged something unbreakable within her, a quiet dignity that no amount of humiliation could erode. When people looked at Maria, they saw an aging woman with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a faded uniform and shoes held together with superglue. What they missed was the fire in her dark eyes, the intelligence that absorbed every conversation, every stock market report playing on the penthouse televisions, every whispered business secret she overheard while dusting bookshelves lined with leather-bound financial journals. Working for the Ashfords paid better than any job Maria had ever held, enough to cover her rent, send money to her elderly mother back in San Salvador, and even start a small savings account that she hoped might one day grow into something meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on her that she cleaned rooms where single pieces of art cost more than she would earn in 5 years, where Richard's watch collection represented more wealth than her entire neighborhood would see in a decade. Yet she arrived each morning with the same quiet professionalism, the same careful attention to detail that had earned her the position after her previous employer, a kind elderly widow, had passed away, leaving Maria to navigate the uncertain waters of Manhattan's domestic employment market. The initial weeks at the Ashford penthouse had been a masterclass in subtle cruelty. Victoria delighted in leaving messes specifically for Maria to clean, dropping wine glasses just to watch her crawl on marble floors collecting shards. The other staff members, a chef, a personal assistant, and a driver, maintained careful distance, afraid that association with the maid might somehow taint their own positions in the household hierarchy. They spoke around Maria as if she were deaf, discussing their college degrees and career aspirations while she scrubbed toilets and changed bed sheets with hands that had once dreamed of holding books instead of the bleach bottles. Richard himself remained largely absent, a ghostly figure who moved through his own home like a man underwater. When their paths crossed in hallways or the expansive living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, he would nod politely but distantly, his eyes always focused on phone screens displaying stock prices, Bitcoin fluctuations, or real estate reports. His office walls were covered with certificates, awards, and photographs from business magazines, featuring him as one of America's most successful entrepreneurs. Forbes had estimated his net worth at $2.3 billion, much of it tied up in diversified investment portfolios that included everything from gold reserves to emerging market funds. But wealth had created a fortress around Richard's heart. The penthouse, with its museum-quality art collection and handcrafted Italian furniture, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Margaret's death had left him grasping for meaning in quarterly profit reports and acquisition meetings, desperately trying to fill an emotional void with financial success. He worked 18-hour days, making decisions that moved millions of dollars across global markets while struggling to remember what his daughter's favorite color was, or when he had last shared a genuine conversation with another human being. The morning Victoria delivered her cruelest insult about Maria's shoes, something shifted in the penthouse's carefully orchestrated indifference. Maria had been polishing the massive dining room table when Victoria swept in wearing $1,000 Louboutin heels, fresh from a shopping expedition that had probably cost more than Maria's monthly salary. The young woman's eyes immediately zeroed in on Maria's feet, and the words spilled out with practiced venom. Maria's response was silence, but Richard, who had been passing through the hallway, caught every word. Something about the scene, the proud set of Maria's shoulders despite the humiliation, the way she continued working without defending herself, reminded him of Margaret's quiet strength during her final months. His wife had faced terminal cancer with the same dignity Maria showed in the face of his daughter's cruelty, never complaining, never asking for pity, simply enduring with grace that left everyone around her feeling small and ashamed. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave, Richard found himself watching her gather her simple belongings, a worn purse, a thermos that had seen better decades, and a paperback novel in Spanish whose pages were soft from repeated readings. She moved with economy of motion, each gesture purposeful and unhurried, despite the emotional wounds Victoria had inflicted earlier. There was something profound in her composure, something that spoke to experiences Richard's wealth could never buy or understand. The next morning brought an unexpected test of Maria's character. Victoria's 6-year-old nephew, James, was visiting for the week while his parents traveled to Europe on business. The boy had awakened in the night with a fever and frightening cough that sent panic through the household. The live-in nanny was off duty. Victoria was at a charity gala she deemed too important to leave, and Richard was locked in emergency conference calls with Tokyo investors dealing with a cryptocurrency market crash that threatened to wipe out substantial portions of his portfolio. Maria found James crying in his bedroom, burning with fever and calling for his mother. Without hesitation, she gathered the child in her arms, her voice flowing into soft Spanish lullabies her own grandmother had sung decades ago in a simpler world. She prepared cool compresses, adjusted pillows to help him breathe easier, and sat beside his bed through the long hours of darkness, monitoring his temperature and offering the kind of comfort that couldn't be bought or hired. Richard discovered them at dawn, Maria asleep in a chair beside James's bed, her hand still resting protectively on the boy's forehead. The fever had broken, and James was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The sight struck Richard like a physical blow. When had he last shown such selfless care for anyone? When had his penthouse last sheltered such genuine love? Maria stirred as he approached, instantly alert despite her exhaustion, checking James's temperature with practiced maternal instincts. "Thank you," Richard whispered, and for the first time in months the words carried real weight. Maria smiled softly, lines crinkling around her tired eyes. "He is a good boy. He just needed someone to stay." The observation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to acknowledge. Richard realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had stayed for him, had offered presence without agenda or expectation of reward. His world was built on transactions, stock trades, property acquisitions, cryptocurrency exchanges, but Maria had given freely, asking nothing in return except the dignity of being treated as human. Over the following weeks, small changes began rippling through the penthouse. Maria's presence brought subtle warmth to spaces that had felt frozen since Margaret's death. She hummed while working, filling silence with melodies that seemed to awaken something long dormant in the apartment's atmosphere. Flowers appeared in vases, nothing expensive, just grocery store bouquets that somehow transformed sterile surfaces into places where life could breathe again. The kitchen, once used only for catered events, started smelling like actual cooking as Maria prepared simple meals for herself, filling the air with cumin and cilantro that reminded Richard of humanity's basic needs. Victoria remained aggressively oblivious to the shifting dynamics, too absorbed in her social media empire and shopping expeditions to notice her father's gradual transformation. She treated Maria with increasing hostility, as if sensing some threat to the established order. Her friends, equally poisoned by inherited wealth and manufactured importance, joined in the casual cruelty whenever they visited, making jokes about the maid's appearance, her accent, her presumed ignorance of their sophisticated world. But Richard was watching now, really watching, and what he saw broke something open inside him. Maria absorbed every insult with dignity that shamed him, continued working with professionalism that earned his respect, and showed kindness to everyone in the household, despite receiving none in return. She read voraciously during her lunch breaks, newspapers, library books, magazines left behind by visitors, and he realized her intelligence was sharp and curious, informed by experiences his Ivy League education had never touched. One afternoon, while Maria cleaned his office, Richard found himself asking about her life outside the penthouse. Her answers came slowly at first, careful and measured, but gradually opened into stories that painted pictures of resilience he had never imagined. She spoke of arriving in America with children and no English, of working 3 jobs while studying for her GED, of saving dollar bills and coffee cans to pay for Miguel's textbooks and Carmen's school supplies. Her investment strategy had been simple but effective. Education for her children, stable housing, and small amounts tucked away for emergencies that inevitably came. "You never thought about investing in stocks?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "With your discipline, you could have built substantial wealth over 20 years. Maria's laugh was gentle but tinged with irony. "Mr. Ashford, when you have $20 left after paying rent, you don't buy Bitcoin. You buy rice and beans and hope they last until the next paycheck." The observation hit Richard like cold water. His investment portfolio included millions in cryptocurrency, tech stocks that had made him fortunes in their volatility, real estate holdings across Manhattan's most exclusive neighborhoods. But he had never faced the choice between financial speculation and feeding his family, never calculated risk against the immediate need for groceries. Besides, Maria continued, dusting his awards with careful attention, my investments paid off differently. Miguel saves lives now. Carmen teaches children to read. That's worth more than any stock dividend. Richard found himself thinking about her words long after she left that evening. His own daughter, raised with every privilege money could provide, had never created anything meaningful, never contributed to anyone's well-being beyond her own. His billions sat in accounts and portfolios, generating more wealth but touching no lives except those of other wealthy people making more money from money itself. The transformation accelerating within Richard didn't go unnoticed by Victoria, whose jealousy and confusion manifested in increasingly aggressive behavior toward Maria. She began timing the maid's activities, criticizing work that had previously gone unnoticed, manufacturing complaints about cleanliness or efficiency. The household staff, sensing the shift in dynamics, chose sides based on self-preservation rather than truth. The explosion came on a Thursday morning when Victoria discovered that $30,000 worth of jewelry had disappeared from her bedroom safe. The combination was known only to family members and had never been shared with staff, but Victoria's rage needed a target, and Maria's quiet dignity made her an irresistible scapegoat. The accusation came fast and vicious. The maid had somehow accessed the safe, stolen the jewelry, and was probably selling it to fund some criminal enterprise in her neighborhood. Richard's world tilted as Victoria demanded immediate action, her voice shrill with privilege and indignation. The other staff members stepped carefully away from involvement, protecting their own positions while Maria stood silent in the center of the storm. She made no protest, offered no defense, simply absorbed the accusation with the same composure she had shown every other humiliation. But Richard's grief-numbed instincts, trained by years of corporate betrayal and financial warfare, overwhelmed his growing respect for Maria. The possibility of theft in his home triggered defensive mechanisms built through decades of protecting his fortune from countless people who had tried to manipulate or deceive him. Without proper investigation, without allowing Maria to speak, he made a decision that would haunt him. She had to go immediately, with no references and no second chances. Maria received the dismissal with quiet dignity that somehow made Richard feel smaller than Victoria's shrieking had. She gathered her few belongings, the worn purse, the thermos, the Spanish novel, and walked toward the door with measured steps. At the threshold, she turned back once, her eyes meeting Richard's with a sadness that seemed to encompass more than just her own situation. I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Ashford, she said softly. It's harder to see when you're standing so far above everything else. The door closed behind her with barely a sound, but its echo seemed to reverberate through every room of the penthouse. Within hours, the apartment felt different, colder, emptier, as if Maria had taken some essential warmth with her. Silence settled back over the spaces she had filled with life, and Richard realized he was mourning something he hadn't known he valued until it was gone. Victoria basked in her victory for exactly 3 days. Then her friend Stephanie, during a casual brunch conversation, mentioned seeing Victoria's jewelry at a pawn shop in Brooklyn, recognized from photographs Victoria had posted on social media. The revelation came through a chain of gossip and chance. Stephanie's driver had been browsing for his wife's birthday gift when he spotted the distinctive pieces. Further investigation revealed that Lucas, the personal assistant who had worked for the family for 8 months, had been systematically stealing smaller items and selling them to fund gambling debts that had spiraled beyond his control. Lucas confessed when confronted with evidence, his polished exterior crumbling to reveal desperation and addiction that had driven him to betray the trust he had cultivated so carefully. He had known Victoria's safe combination, because he had observed her opening it while delivering messages, had planned the theft during the week Maria would be blamed, counting on her vulnerable position and the family's prejudices to deflect suspicion. Richard felt physically sick as the truth emerged. Maria's quiet dignity in the face of false accusations now appeared even more remarkable. She had known she was innocent, but had accepted punishment rather than fighting an unwinnable battle against prejudice and power. His wealth and intelligence, his sophisticated understanding of global markets and complex financial instruments, had meant nothing when faced with his own emotional blindness. The search for Maria began immediately, but proved more challenging than Richard had anticipated. She had no listed phone number, no social media presence, no digital footprint in the online world where he conducted most of his business. The Dominican neighborhood where she lived operated by different rules: word of mouth, community networks, face-to-face relationships that couldn't be accessed through corporate connections or private investigators. Richard found himself taking the subway for the first time in decades, riding the A train to Washington Heights, with the strange sensation of being just another passenger among working people heading home after long days. The neighborhood pulsed with life he had forgotten existed: children playing in streets, older men gathered around folding tables playing dominoes, women shopping for ingredients in markets that smelled like home cooking and fresh possibility. Maria's building was a modest pre-war structure, squeezed between a Dominican restaurant and a barber shop where merengue music spilled onto sidewalks, along with animated conversations in rapid Spanish. Richard climbed stairs that creaked under his expensive shoes, following apartment numbers until he reached a door marked with hand-painted numbers and the faint sound of television news in Spanish. His knock was answered by a young man in paramedic uniform, who looked at Richard with immediate suspicion and recognition. Miguel Vasquez had inherited his mother's intelligence and dignity, but also a protective instinct that flared when wealthy strangers appeared at their door seeking his mother. "She's not here," Miguel said simply, blocking the doorway with his presence. "I need to speak with her. I made a terrible mistake." "Yeah, we know about your mistake." Miguel's voice carried anger that had been simmering for weeks. "You accused my mother of being a thief. You fired her without letting her defend herself. You treated her like garbage after she spent months caring for your family like we were her own." Richard felt the weight of judgment from someone whose opinion mattered, because it was earned through character rather than inherited through wealth. "Where is she?" "Somewhere safe from people who think money gives them the right to destroy other people's lives." Miguel stepped forward slightly, and Richard realized the young man was physically imposing despite his controlled demeanor. "My mother worked for you for months. She came home exhausted every day but never complained because she respected the work. She talked about your little nephew, worried about your daughter's anger, even worried about you sitting alone in that big, empty apartment. And this is how you repaid her kindness." The indictment stung because it was accurate. Richard had repaid Maria's care with suspicion, her dignity with dismissal, her loyalty with abandonment. "I want to make this right." Miguel's laugh was bitter. "You want to make it right? You can't buy back what you destroyed. My mother defended you when people in our neighborhood said rich people were all the same. She said you were just hurting, that your wife's death had made you scared of trusting anyone. She made excuses for your daughter's cruelty, said the girl was probably lonely and taking it out on whoever was safe to hurt. Even after you fired her, she wouldn't let me or Carmen say anything bad about your family." Each revelation was like a physical blow to Richard's conscience. Maria had protected his reputation even while suffering from his failure to protect hers. She had seen his pain, understood his vulnerability, and responded with compassion that he had repaid with betrayal. "Please," Richard said quietly, "I need to apologize to her properly. I need to make sure she's all right." Miguel studied him for a long moment, weighing anger against his mother's years of teaching about forgiveness and second chances. Finally, he opened the door wider. "She's at my sister's place in Queens, but I'm going with you, and if you hurt her again, with words, with accusations, with anything, You'll find out that money can't protect you from everything. The drive to Carmen's apartment in Elmhurst took them through neighborhoods where Richard's wealth was invisible and meaningless. Carmen Vasquez had inherited her mother's teacher's heart, but also a fierce protectiveness that showed in her eyes when Richard entered her modest living room, where Maria sat with two small children, helping them with homework at a kitchen table covered with school papers and crayons. Maria looked up as Richard entered, and he saw in her face the cost of his betrayal. She looked older, more tired, as if the false accusation had drained something essential from her spirit, but her eyes still held dignity, still reflected intelligence and strength that his wealth could never diminish. "Mrs. Vasquez," Richard began, his voice carrying humility he rarely accessed, "I came to apologize." Maria's grandchildren looked between the adults with curious eyes, sensing tension they couldn't understand. Carmen moved protectively closer to her mother, while Miguel maintained position near the door like a guardian who wouldn't be easily moved. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Ashford," Maria said quietly. "You did what you thought was right." "No, I didn't. I did what was easy. I did what protected me from having to think or investigate or trust someone who had earned better treatment." Richard felt tears he hadn't shed since Margaret's funeral gathering behind his eyes. "Lucas confessed. The jewelry was found. You were innocent, and I knew it in my heart, but chose suspicion over faith." Maria's expression softened slightly, but her children remained alert to any sign that their mother might be hurt again. The little ones at the table continued working on math problems, their pencils scratching against paper in rhythm that somehow made the adult conversation feel more real and immediate. "I understand why you didn't trust me," Maria said. "When you have so much to lose, everyone looks like a threat. Your world taught you that kindness always has a price, that people like me always want something from people like you." Her insight into his psychology was more accurate than years of expensive therapy had ever been. Richard realized that Maria understood him better than he understood himself, had seen through his defensive wealthy exterior to the frightened man underneath who used money as a barrier against a world that had taken his wife and left him emotionally stranded. "I want to offer you your job back," Richard said, "with a raise, with an apology to Victoria and the entire staff, with whatever it takes to repair the damage I caused." Maria shook her head gently. "I don't want my job back, Mr. Ashford. I want something more valuable than employment." Richard waited, afraid to ask what she might demand, prepared to write checks or make financial arrangements to assuage his guilt. "I want you to understand that people like me, people who clean your homes and care for your children and know your secrets, we're not invisible. We have hearts that break when you treat us like enemies. We have dignity that doesn't disappear because we need paychecks. We have intelligence and feelings and stories that matter even if we don't have college degrees or stock portfolios." The truth hit Richard with force that made his chest tight. He had spent months seeing Maria as furniture that happened to move and speak, useful for maintaining his lifestyle, but not worthy of genuine human consideration. Her pain was real. Her humiliation had consequences that extended beyond his penthouse into a family and community that loved and valued her. "How do I make this right?" he asked again, but this time the question came from a deeper place. Maria looked at her children, at her grandchildren working on homework, at the modest apartment filled with love and mutual respect. "You go home and look at your daughter. Really look at her. See that she's becoming someone who thinks cruelty is entertaining, that money makes her better than other people. You're teaching her that people like me don't matter, and someday that lesson is going to poison her whole life." Richard realized that Victoria's behavior toward Maria was a reflection of lessons he had taught through indifference and privilege, that wealth without empathy was creating a monster who would never find genuine happiness or human connection. "Will you come back?" he asked, "not as an employee, but as someone who might help me learn to be better?" Maria considered the request for a long moment, her eyes moving between her protective children and the broken man who had traveled across the city to seek forgiveness from someone he had wronged. "I'll come back," she said finally. But things will be different. I won't accept disrespect from anyone in your household. I won't pretend to be invisible when people talk about me like I'm not there. And if you hire me, you're also hiring the person I really am, someone with opinions and feelings and the right to be treated with dignity." Richard nodded quickly, relief flooding through him. "Anything you want. Any conditions you set." "I don't want charity or guilt money," Maria continued. "I want fair wages for honest work, and I want your word that you'll try to see people differently. Not just me, but everyone who works for you, everyone who serves your family, everyone whose lives make your comfortable life possible." The drive back to Manhattan was quiet, each of them processing the emotional weight of reconciliation. Richard found himself noticing things he had missed on the trip uptown, the tired faces of people riding buses home from jobs that barely paid enough for survival, the creativity and resilience visible in neighborhoods where money was scarce but community was strong, the dignity of working people who built and maintained the city that generated his wealth. Maria's return to the penthouse created ripples that transformed the household's entire atmosphere. Victoria initially protested the decision, but Richard's newfound clarity about his daughter's character led to conversations they should have had years earlier. He began setting boundaries, demanding respect for everyone under his roof, and gradually withdrawing the unlimited financial support that had enabled Victoria's cruelty and entitlement. The other staff members watched carefully as dynamics shifted, slowly beginning to treat Maria with the respect due to someone who clearly held the employer's genuine regard. Richard made public apologies, took responsibility for his failure of judgment, and began implementing changes that elevated everyone's working conditions and job security. But the most profound transformation occurred in Richard himself. Margaret's death had left him emotionally frozen, using work and wealth accumulation as anesthesia against grief and loneliness. Maria's presence didn't erase his pain, but it reminded him that healing required human connection, that isolation, even luxurious isolation, was a prison he had built for himself. Months passed, and the penthouse became something it had never been during Richard's marriage, a place where different kinds of people could coexist with mutual respect. Maria brought friends from her neighborhood to help with special events, introducing Richard to a world of small business owners, community organizers, and working families whose dreams were modest, but whose contributions were enormous. He began understanding that his wealth had meaning only when it connected to other people's lives in positive ways. Victoria's transformation took longer and required more painful self-examination. Her father's changed priorities forced her to confront the emptiness of her social media persona and shopping-based identity. Slowly, reluctantly, she began engaging with Maria as a human being rather than a servant, discovering intelligence and life experience that challenged her assumptions about class and worth. The penthouse that had once felt like a museum became a place where laughter echoed down marble hallways, where genuine conversations replaced superficial small talk, where Maria's grandchildren played safely among priceless art collections that no longer seemed more important than the people enjoying them. One evening, nearly a year after Maria's return, Richard found her reading in the library, not furtively during a break, but openly, comfortably, in a chair he had specifically designated as hers. The book was a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Maria looked up when he entered with a smile that held genuine warmth. "She was an interesting woman," Maria said, closing the book with a finger holding her place. "Born rich like your daughter, but she chose to use her advantages to help people instead of looking down on them." Richard settled into a nearby chair, something that would have been unthinkable during his first months of employing Maria. "Do you think Victoria can change that much?" "People can change anything they want to change," Maria replied, "but they have to want it. Change can't be bought or forced. It has to come from understanding that being better feels better than being superior." Her wisdom continued to amaze Richard, insights that came from lived experience rather than formal education. Maria had become not just an employee, but a teacher, showing him that character was built through choices made when no one was watching, that dignity was earned through how people treated those who couldn't help or harm them. The financial markets that had once consumed Richard's attention still required management, but he began viewing his wealth differently. His investment portfolio now included funds specifically designed to support affordable housing development, education initiatives in underserved communities, and small business loans for immigrant entrepreneurs. The Bitcoin and stock profits that had once existed solely to generate more wealth became tools for creating opportunities for people who reminded him of Maria's journey. Victoria, watching her father's transformation, began questioning her own relationship with money and meaning. She enrolled in social work classes, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm as she discovered satisfaction in helping rather than consuming. The designer clothes and expensive entertainment that had once defined her identity gradually gave way to volunteer work and genuine friendships with people who valued her efforts rather than her father's bank account. On a crisp autumn afternoon, as Maria arranged flowers from the rooftop garden she had cultivated on the penthouse terrace, Richard approached with an envelope that contained more than her weekly paycheck. "What's this?" Maria asked, examining the unexpected addition. "Investment advice," Richard said with a smile that had become natural rather than practiced. "You were right that survival comes before speculation, but your children are grown now, and you've earned some financial security. I've set up accounts that will help your money work for you the way mine works for me." Maria opened the envelope to find documents establishing education funds for her grandchildren, a retirement account that would ensure her dignity in old age, and investment certificates in her own name that represented a small but growing stake in the American dream she had worked toward for decades. "This is too much," she protested, but Richard shook his head. "It's not a gift, it's recognition. You invested in your children's futures when you had almost nothing, and they became people who make the world better. You invested in my family when we gave you every reason to walk away, and we became people who deserve your respect. Now I'm investing in your future because I've learned that the best returns come from helping good people build good lives." Maria's eyes filled with tears she had rarely allowed herself to shed, tears not of sadness or frustration, but of recognition and gratitude. The woman who had arrived at the Ashford penthouse wearing shoes held together with superglue was still essentially the same person, but her worth was finally being acknowledged in concrete ways that would ripple forward through generations. The penthouse that evening held a small celebration. Nothing elaborate, just families sharing a meal prepared by Maria with ingredients Richard had helped select at the Washington Heights market she had introduced him to weeks earlier. Catherine sat with Miguel and Carmen, asking genuine questions about their work and lives. Victoria played with Maria's grandchildren, teaching them card games and laughing at their jokes with affection that wasn't performed for social media cameras. As the evening wound down and families prepared to return to their respective homes, Richard realized that wealth had always been about human connections he had simply been too isolated to see. The penthouse was full of people who cared about each other, who had built relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Margaret would have loved this gathering, would have recognized in it the kind of celebration she had always hoped their family might host. Maria was the last to leave, gathering her purse, a new one now, but still practical, and the flowers she cut from the garden each week to take home. At the door, she paused and looked back at Richard, who was clearing dishes with a domesticity that would have shocked his business associates. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for teaching me that being good is more important than being right," Richard replied. "Thank you for showing me that dignity isn't about where you come from, but about how you treat people along the way." The door closed behind her with the same soft sound it had made the day she left in disgrace, but now the echo carried promise instead of emptiness. Richard understood that Maria would always be moving between worlds, her neighborhood and his, her family and his family, her experiences and his privileges. But now those worlds were connected by genuine respect and mutual understanding. 6 months later, Richard stood before a congressional committee discussing wealth inequality and social responsibility, using Maria's story, with her permission, as an example of how individual actions could bridge economic divides. His testimony argued for policies that supported working families, educational opportunities, and paths to financial security for people whose labor sustained America's economy but rarely shared in its prosperity. Victoria had enrolled full-time in graduate school for social work, her Twitter account now promoting literacy programs rather than luxury purchases. She still lived in the penthouse, but her relationship with wealth had fundamentally changed. She understood it as responsibility rather than privilege, as tool rather than identity. Maria continued working for the Ashford family, but her role had evolved into household manager, financial advisor for the family's charitable initiatives, and bridge between Richard's rarefied world and the communities where real life happened. Her worn shoes had been replaced by sturdy, comfortable ones, appropriate for someone whose opinion mattered, whose presence was valued, whose wisdom was actively sought. The story of Maria Elena Vasquez and Richard Ashford III became something neither had expected, a demonstration that change was possible when people chose connection over isolation, understanding over judgment, growth over stagnation. The penthouse remained elegant and expensive, but it had become a home where different kinds of people could find welcome, where conversations mattered more than acquisitions, where success was measured by relationships rather than quarterly reports. But this transformation wasn't without its challenges and setbacks. The world outside the penthouse hadn't changed as quickly as the people within it. Richard discovered that using his wealth responsibly often meant disappointing business partners who expected him to prioritize profit over principle. Investment opportunities that might have doubled his net worth were declined because they involved companies with poor labor practices or environmental records that reminded him too much of the systems that had kept people like Maria struggling for survival. Victoria's journey proved even more complicated. Her social circle didn't understand her new interests, and she found herself increasingly isolated from friends who viewed her volunteer work as a phase or, worse, as betrayal of their shared class identity. The parties she had once enjoyed now felt hollow, conversations about designer purchases and exotic vacations seeming trivial against the backdrop of real problems she was learning to address through her social work studies. One particularly difficult evening, Victoria came home from a disastrous dinner with college friends who had mocked her new humanitarian phase and suggested she was only helping poor people to rebel against her father. She found Maria in the kitchen, preparing tea with the careful attention she brought to every task. "They think I'm pretending," Victoria said without preamble, her voice thick with frustration and self-doubt. "They think I'm playing at caring about other people." Maria looked up from measuring loose tea leaves, her dark eyes taking in Victoria's distress with maternal concern that had developed naturally over months of watching the young woman struggle to become someone better than her upbringing had prepared her to be. "Are you pretending?" Maria asked gently. "No." Victoria's response came quickly, then softened as she considered the question more deeply. "At least, I don't think I am. But sometimes I wonder if they're right, if I'm just trying to prove something to you and Dad, if I'll get bored and go back to being the person I was before." Maria set 2 cups on the counter and waited for the water to boil, her silence giving Victoria space to continue processing her doubts aloud. "Today I was at the community center, tutoring kids from the neighborhood, and one of them, a little girl named Sophia, she was struggling with fractions. When she finally understood, when her face lit up because she got it, I felt something I'd never experienced buying $1,000 shoes or getting likes on Instagram. But then tonight, sitting with people I've known since prep school, I felt like a fraud." The kettle whistled softly, and Maria poured hot water over the tea leaves with movements that seemed meditative in their precision. "When I first came to America," she said, "I worked in a factory making children's clothes. Every day I sewed the same seams on tiny dresses and shirts, hundreds of them, until my fingers were numb and my back ached from bending over the machine." Victoria waited, understanding that Maria's stories always contained guidance disguised as simple sharing. The other women who worked there, they had been sewing for years, decades, some of them. They were very good at their work, very fast, very precise. But when I started, I was slow. I made mistakes. I had to redo seams that weren't straight. Maria poured tea into both cups, the steam carrying hints of chamomile and honey. Some of the women were kind, helped me learn. Others whispered that I was just playing at being a seamstress, that I would quit as soon as I found something easier. Did you quit? No, but not because I wanted to prove anything to the women who doubted me. I kept working because Miguel needed school clothes and Carmen needed books, and that job was how I could provide those things. My motivation wasn't about other people's opinions, it was about the love I had for my children. Victoria accepted the warm cup Maria offered, inhaling the soothing aroma while processing the parallel Maria was drawing. Your friends tonight, they are still living in the world where the most important thing is what other people think of your choices. But you are moving into a different world where the most important thing is whether your choices help people who need help. Sophia doesn't care if you're pretending when she learns fractions. She only cares that someone took time to help her understand. The wisdom hit Victoria with the gentle force of all Maria's insights, simple truths that cut through complexity and self-doubt. Her old friend's mockery said more about their own fear of meaningful responsibility than about Victoria's authenticity. Over the following months, Victoria's social circle naturally evolved. She formed friendships with classmates in her social work program, people who chose their careers based on calling rather than salary potential. She connected with other volunteers at the community center, discovering relationships built on shared purpose rather than shared privilege. The transition wasn't easy. Money had provided social shortcuts that were no longer available, but the connections she built were deeper and more satisfying than any she had known before. Richard, meanwhile, was learning that ethical wealth management required constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. A hostile takeover opportunity that could have netted his firm hundreds of millions in fees was declined because it would have resulted in massive layoffs at a manufacturing company employing thousands of workers in communities already struggling with economic displacement. The decision cost him relationships with other investors who viewed his new scruples as weakness, or worse, as virtue signaling designed to enhance his public image. The criticism stung more than Richard had anticipated. For decades, his identity had been built around being respected in financial circles, known for his ability to maximize returns regardless of external consequences. Now, former colleagues whispered that Margaret's death had made him soft, that his household help was manipulating him into making poor business decisions that would eventually erode his wealth and influence. These doubts came to a head during a tense board meeting where Richard's refusal to approve a particularly lucrative but ethically questionable investment resulted in heated confrontation with other board members. The project involved purchasing debt from struggling Caribbean nations at steep discounts, then using legal pressure to force full repayment that would devastating those countries' ability to fund education and healthcare for their citizens. This is exactly the kind of opportunity that built your fortune in the first place, argued Jonathan Whitmore, a longtime business partner whose own wealth exceeded $1 billion. Since when do you care more about abstract principles than concrete profits? Since I learned that abstract principles have concrete consequences for real people, Richard replied, his voice steady despite the hostile atmosphere in the mahogany-paneled conference room. People like your maid? The question came from Patricia Hendricks, a venture capitalist known for her sharp tongue and sharper business instincts. Has it occurred to you that a woman who cleans toilets for a living might not be the best advisor on complex international finance? The room fell silent as Richard considered his response. These were people he had worked with for years, who had made him hundreds of millions through their shared willingness to prioritize profit above all other considerations. Their respect had once meant everything to him. Their approval had validated his success in ways that mere money could not. Maria Elena Vasquez has taught me more about real value than 20 years of investment banking, Richard said finally. She understands that wealth means nothing if you have to become someone you can't respect in order to acquire it. She knows that the true measure of success isn't what you accumulate, but what you contribute. The meeting ended with Richard's resignation from 2 investment funds and the dissolution of partnerships that had been central to his business operations for decades. Walking home through Central Park, he felt lighter, despite knowing that his decision would cost him tens of millions in future earnings and potentially damage his reputation in financial communities where he had once been a respected leader. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave the penthouse after another day of work that had evolved far beyond mere cleaning, Richard found himself sharing the day's events with someone whose opinion had become more valuable than any board's approval. "Do you think I made the right choice?" he asked, genuinely uncertain about decisions that would have significant consequences for his family's financial future. Maria paused in gathering her belongings, considering the question with the seriousness she brought to all matters involving moral complexity. When Miguel was in high school, he had a chance to cheat on a test that would determine whether he got into the college program he wanted. The other students were doing it. The teacher wasn't watching carefully, and the scholarship he needed depended on perfect grades. Richard waited for the lesson he knew was coming, disguised as family history. He came home and asked me what he should do. I told him that cheating might get him into college, but it would also teach him that his dreams were more important than his integrity. If he built his success on lies, he would spend the rest of his life wondering if he deserved what he achieved. The parallel was clear but not simplistic. Richard's choice to decline unethical investment opportunities was similar to Miguel's choice to maintain academic integrity, even when it might have cost him opportunities. Miguel took the test honestly, got a B instead of an A, and didn't get the scholarship he wanted. But he got a different scholarship based on his volunteer work, went to a different college, and became the paramedic who saves lives every day. He sleeps well at night because he knows he earned everything he has. The money I'll lose by making ethical choices. That's real money that could have funded philanthropy, education programs, community development projects. Doesn't that matter? Maria's smile carried the gentleness she reserved for Richard's most vulnerable questions. Money earned through harming others carries a poison that spreads to everything it touches. The good you might do with unethical wealth would always be compromised by the harm you allowed to create it. Better to have less money that you can use with a clean conscience than more money that makes you complicit in others' suffering. Her wisdom, as always, cut to the heart of moral complexity he had been struggling to navigate alone. Richard realized that his transformation wasn't complete. He was still thinking like a wealthy man trying to calculate the financial cost of ethical behavior rather than like a human being for whom ethical behavior was simply the foundation of any decision worth making. The ripple effects of Richard's changed priorities extended beyond his business relationships into the larger cultural and political contexts where extreme wealth intersected with social responsibility. His congressional testimony had been noticed by journalists, policy researchers, and other business leaders wrestling with similar questions about the role of inherited and accumulated wealth in determining social outcomes. Invitations arrived requesting his participation in forums on economic inequality, panels discussing corporate social responsibility, and initiatives aimed at encouraging wealthy individuals to make voluntary contributions toward addressing systemic problems their success had helped create. Each opportunity required Richard to articulate publicly the private transformation that began with Maria's influence, but had evolved into a comprehensive worldview that sometimes put him at odds with his own financial interests. A particularly significant moment came when Richard was invited to address the annual meeting of the Economic Policy Institute, a think tank focused on policies supporting working families. The audience included economists, labor organizers, policymakers, and representatives from communities directly affected by the kinds of investment strategies Richard had once pursued without considering their human costs. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected America's economic diversity, Richard felt the weight of representing not just his own story, but also the possibility that other wealthy individuals might choose similar paths toward greater social responsibility. 2 years ago, I would have dismissed this gathering as irrelevant to my business interests, he began, his voice steady despite internal nervousness about speaking to people whose expertise was built on understanding systems rather than exploiting them. I measured success purely in financial terms, viewed regulatory policy as interference with market efficiency, and considered my wealth to be proof of my superior decision-making abilities. The audience listened with the skeptical attention reserved for wealthy individuals, attempting to explain their enlightenment to people who had never had the luxury of ignoring systemic inequality. My transformation didn't come from reading economic theory or attending sensitivity training seminars. It came from working closely with someone whose intelligence, integrity, and life experience forced me to confront the human consequences of my financial choices. Maria Elena Vasquez taught me that there is no such thing as apolitical wealth, no such thing as value-neutral investment decisions, no such thing as success that exists in isolation from the community that makes it possible. Richard went on to describe specific changes in his investment portfolio, the establishment of funds dedicated to affordable housing development, educational scholarships for first-generation college students, and small business loans for entrepreneurs from immigrant communities. He detailed the millions of dollars in potential profits he had declined because the opportunities involved exploiting vulnerable populations or environmental resources. But the most important part of his testimony focused on the personal transformation that made financial changes possible. Wealth without empathy is not just morally bankrupt, it's psychologically devastating. I spent years accumulating money while becoming increasingly isolated from meaningful human relationships. My marriage suffered, my relationship with my daughter was superficial, and I had no genuine friendships built on mutual respect rather than mutual benefit. The audience began responding with questions that challenged Richard to go deeper than personal anecdotes into structural analysis of how individual choices by wealthy people could address systemic problems that required coordinated policy responses. "Your personal transformation is inspiring," said Dr. Angela Rodriguez, a labor economist whose research focused on wage inequality. But individual conscience isn't sufficient to address problems created by entire systems designed to concentrate wealth. What policy changes would you support that might actually require you to pay more taxes or accept regulations that limit your investment options? The question was exactly the kind of challenge Richard had learned to expect from people whose primary concern was structural change rather than individual redemption narratives. His answer required him to move beyond personal storytelling into political positions that could have real consequences for his remaining wealth and business interests. "I support progressive taxation that recognizes wealth accumulation's dependence on public infrastructure, educational systems, and social stability," Richard replied. "I support regulatory frameworks that prevent the kinds of predatory lending, environmental exploitation, and labor abuses that generate profits by externalizing costs to communities that can't defend themselves. And I support policies that make basic necessities like healthcare, education, and housing accessible to everyone, regardless of their family's financial status." Each policy position represented views that would have horrified his former business associates and political allies, but Richard had discovered that moral consistency required accepting the political and financial implications of ethical principles. The months following his public advocacy brought both criticism and support from unexpected directions. Some wealthy individuals reached out privately to discuss similar struggles with the ethical implications of their success, while others worked actively to undermine his influence in business and philanthropic circles. Victoria, meanwhile, had progressed far enough in her social work studies to begin field placement at a community health center in the Bronx, working with families navigating complex challenges involving poverty, immigration status, healthcare access, and educational barriers. The work was emotionally demanding in ways that her privileged upbringing had never prepared her to handle, but it was also more fulfilling than any experience her wealth had previously purchased. One afternoon, Victoria arrived home visibly distressed after a particularly difficult day working with a family whose teenage daughter had been hospitalized, following a suicide attempt triggered by bullying at school related to her family's undocumented immigration status. Maria found Victoria sitting in the kitchen, still wearing her professional clothes, but looking younger and more vulnerable than she had in years. "I don't know how to help her," Victoria said without preamble, referring to the teenage girl whose despair had shaken Victoria's confidence in her ability to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. "She's smart and talented and funny, but she's convinced that being undocumented means she has no future worth living for. Everything I learned in school about counseling techniques and support systems feels inadequate when she's facing problems this big." Maria poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Victoria, recognizing the crisis of faith that often accompanied young social workers' first encounters with systemic problems that couldn't be solved through individual intervention. "When Carmen was 15, Maria began, she came home from school crying because her English teacher had humiliated her in front of the class, making jokes about her accent and suggesting that students who couldn't speak proper English should consider vocational training instead of college preparation." Victoria looked up from her coffee, drawn into the story despite her own emotional exhaustion. Carmen was devastated. She'd been working so hard to fit in, to prove she belonged in advanced classes, and this teacher made her feel like her efforts were worthless. That night, she told me she wanted to drop out of school, that maybe the teacher was right and she should focus on jobs that didn't require perfect English. What did you do? I listened to her pain without trying to fix it immediately. Then I shared something I had never told her before, that when I first arrived in America, I was so ashamed of my limited English that I would pretend to be deaf when strangers tried to talk to me, because I thought being deaf was less embarrassing than being stupid. Victoria's eyes widened at this revelation. In all the months of working and talking together, Maria had never shared this level of personal vulnerability about her early struggles with language and belonging. But slowly, I realized that my accent didn't make my thoughts less valuable, and my limited vocabulary didn't make my feelings less real. I started seeing my bilingual abilities as strength rather than weakness, my immigrant experience as wisdom rather than disadvantage. Did that help Carmen? It helped her understand that shame was not the same as truth, that other people's prejudices were their problems, not hers. But the most important thing I did was advocate for her. I went to the school, demanded a meeting with the principal, and made it clear that my daughter deserved respect, regardless of how her English sounded to teachers who had never learned a second language. Victoria began to understand the connection Maria was drawing between Carmen's experience and the suicidal teenager she was trying to help. The girl you're working with, she needs someone to believe in her future, even when she can't see it herself. But she also needs systemic changes that you can't provide through individual counseling, immigration policies that offer pathways to legal status, educational opportunities that don't depend on documentation, communities that welcome rather than exclude families like hers. That feels overwhelming. How do I help her right now while also working toward changes that might take years or decades? Maria's smile carried hard-won wisdom about balancing immediate care with long-term activism. You do both. You sit with her pain, you help her find reasons to stay alive today, you connect her with resources and support networks, and you also vote, advocate, volunteer with organizations working to change the policies that create her despair. Individual healing and systemic change aren't separate projects. they support each other. Victoria realized that her social work training had emphasized individual intervention techniques, but had provided limited guidance about connecting personal healing to political action. Maria's perspective, shaped by decades of navigating systems designed to marginalize families like hers, offered a more integrated approach to addressing problems that were both deeply personal and inherently political. The conversation marked another milestone in Victoria's evolution from privileged consumer to engaged citizen. She began volunteering with immigrant rights organizations, participating in voter registration drives, and using her remaining trust fund money to support policy advocacy groups working on issues affecting the communities where she provided direct services. Richard, watching his daughter's continued transformation, felt pride mixed with concern about the emotional and financial costs of choosing engagement over comfort. Both he and Victoria were discovering that moral awakening came with obligations that extended far beyond their family's private philanthropy into sustained political action that sometimes put them at odds with their former social circles and financial interests. The Ashford penthouse had become a gathering place for conversations that would have been impossible during the family's earlier isolation in wealth-protected privilege. Maria's friends and colleagues from Washington Heights brought perspectives shaped by working-class experience and immigrant resilience. Victoria's classmates and co-workers contributed insights from academic social work training, combined with direct service experience. Richard's reformulated business associates included entrepreneurs focused on social impact alongside financial returns. These diverse gatherings created a unique space where different forms of expertise and experience could interact to generate solutions that purely wealthy or purely academic or purely community-based approaches might miss. But they also highlighted ongoing tensions between individual transformation and systemic change, between charitable intervention and political advocacy, between personal relationships and policy positions. One particularly memorable evening brought together Carmen and her teaching colleagues, Miguel and several paramedics from his station, Maria's older sister who had recently arrived from El Salvador, Richard's former business partner who was wrestling with similar ethical questions about wealth and responsibility, and Victoria's field supervisor from the health center where she was completing her social work practicum. The conversation that emerged touched on education funding, immigration policy, healthcare access, labor organizing, and the role of wealthy individuals in supporting rather than leading social change movements. Arguments developed, perspectives clashed, and temporary alliances formed around specific issues while dissolving around others. Richard found himself defending positions that would have seemed absurd to his former self, while grappling with critiques from people whose lived experience gave them authority he could never match, despite his financial resources and educational credentials. The evening was intellectually stimulating and emotionally challenging in ways that his previous social interactions had rarely achieved. "Rich people like you can support our work," said Isabella Morales, a community organizer who had grown up 3 blocks from Maria's apartment. "But you can't lead it. When wealthy people take over movements for economic justice, those movements start serving wealthy people's consciences instead of poor people's actual needs." The critique stung because it contained truth Richard was still learning to accept. His money could fund important work. His political connections could open doors for advocacy efforts. His public platform could amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. But his class position would always limit his understanding of problems he had never experienced, and his privilege would always create temptations to center his own comfort over other people's liberation. "So, what's my role?" Richard asked, genuinely seeking guidance about how to use his advantages responsibly rather than defensively. "Listen more than you talk," Miguel replied, his paramedic training evident in his direct communication style. "Pay more than you have to. Vote against your own financial interests when those interests hurt people who can't protect themselves. And remember that being a good ally is a daily choice, not a permanent identity you earn once and keep forever. The guidance was harder to follow than Richard had anticipated. Listening required suppressing habits of intellectual dominance developed through decades of being the smartest person in rooms full of people trying to impress him. Paying more than required meant constantly researching fair wages, ethical vendors, and investment opportunities that prioritized social impact over maximum returns. Voting against his financial interests required staying informed about policy details he had previously ignored, since they didn't affect his daily life directly. But the most challenging instruction involved remembering that good intentions weren't sufficient to guarantee positive impact, that wealth created blind spots that required constant vigilance to recognize, that his transformation was an ongoing process rather than an accomplished fact. As winter deepened into spring, the changes in the Ashford household had attracted attention from journalists interested in stories about wealth, responsibility, and social transformation. Richard received interview requests from magazines focused on philanthropy, newspapers covering economic inequality, and television programs exploring the role of class in American society. Each media appearance required him to balance authentic storytelling with privacy protection for Maria and her family, personal narrative with political analysis, and individual transformation with systemic critique. The attention was flattering but also overwhelming, creating pressure to represent possibilities for change while remaining honest about the limitations and contradictions of his ongoing evolution. Maria, characteristically, provided perspective that helped Richard navigate the complex ethics of publicity around their relationship and his transformation. "Your story isn't just about you," she reminded him during one of their evening conversations in the kitchen that had become their informal counseling space. "It's also about me, about my family, about our community." If telling your story helps other people think differently about wealth and responsibility, then the publicity serves a purpose beyond your personal satisfaction. But if it becomes about making you famous as a reformed rich person, then it's just another way of using my experience to benefit your reputation. Her insight highlighted tensions Richard hadn't fully considered. Media coverage of his transformation inevitably focused more on his dramatic awakening than on Maria's patient teaching, more on his financial sacrifices than on her emotional labor, more on his newfound ethics than on her lifetime of dignified resistance to dehumanizing treatment. Working with journalists to tell a more balanced story required Richard to practice the same kind of humility and attention to others' preferences that had made his personal transformation possible. He insisted that profiles include substantial sections about Maria's intelligence, Carmen's educational achievements, Miguel's life-saving work, and the broader community of working people whose contributions made wealthy lifestyles possible. Some reporters resisted this approach, preferring simpler narratives about individual redemption that didn't require addressing structural inequality or systemic injustice. But Richard had learned to prioritize truthful representation over favorable coverage, authentic relationships over public relations advantages, and long-term social impact over short-term personal benefit. The story of Maria Elena Vasquez and Richard Ashford III emerged as something more complex and challenging than either inspiration or condemnation. It became an exploration of how individual relationships could create possibilities for mutual transformation without erasing the power imbalances and structural inequalities that shaped those relationships from the beginning. The penthouse remained elegant and expensive, but it had become a space where working-class wisdom and upper-class resources could combine to create something neither could achieve independently. Maria's intelligence, experience, and moral clarity provided guidance that Richard's education and business success had never accessed. Richard's wealth, connections, and public platform created opportunities for social impact that Maria's individual efforts could never have reached. Their partnership, complicated by class differences, strengthened by mutual respect, challenged by ongoing inequality, and sustained by genuine affection, demonstrated that change was possible without being easy, that growth required discomfort, and that real transformation involved entire communities rather than isolated individuals. Victoria's graduation from social work school brought together families and communities that had become interconnected through months of shared meals, political discussions, housing searches, immigration hearings, medical emergencies, and celebrations that no amount of money could have purchased, but that money could support when handled with wisdom and generosity. The ceremony took place at a public university in Queens, where Victoria had completed her degree through evening and weekend classes designed for working students. The audience included social workers, community organizers, healthcare providers, teachers, and families whose lives were interwoven through mutual aid networks that crossed ethnic, economic, and generational boundaries. Richard sat beside Maria's elderly mother, who had recently joined them from El Salvador, and Victoria's former classmates who had initially viewed her wealth with suspicion, but had grown to appreciate her genuine commitment to learning from people whose experiences differed dramatically from her privileged upbringing. As Victoria's name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her Master of Social Work degree, Richard felt pride that was different from any satisfaction his business achievements had ever provided. This accomplishment represented not just Victoria's individual success, but her integration into a community dedicated to serving people who had often been harmed by the very systems that had generated the Ashford family's wealth. After the ceremony, the celebration continued at the penthouse with food prepared by Maria, Carmen, and several of their neighbors who had become experts at creating abundance from modest budgets and sharing it generously with anyone who needed nourishment, fellowship, or simply a place to belong. The gathering included Victoria's field supervisor, classmates from her program, families from the health center where she had completed her internship, Richard's reformed business associates, and the extended network of friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had become part of the Ashford family's transformed social world. Looking around the penthouse that evening, Richard realized that wealth had finally achieved its potential to create something meaningful, not through accumulation or consumption, but through connection, sharing, and the patient work of building relationships across the boundaries that money usually reinforced rather than dissolved. Maria, moving between conversations with the grace of someone who belonged equally in every group, caught Richard's eye across the room and smiled with satisfaction that encompassed all the struggles, growth, disappointments, and victories that had brought them to this moment of celebration. The woman who had arrived at their door wearing shoes held together with superglue had transformed not just her own circumstances, but an entire family's understanding of what real wealth could accomplish when guided by wisdom, seasoned by humility, and shared with love. This story isn't just about a maid and a millionaire. It's about every person who cleans offices after everyone else goes home, who cares for children while parents build careers, who serves food with a smile despite earning wages that barely cover basic needs. It's about recognition that dignity isn't determined by bank balances, that intelligence isn't measured by formal education, that the people who sustain our comfortable lives deserve respect, fair compensation, and the opportunity to dream beyond survival. Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you been the invisible hands that held a family or business together while your contributions went unnoticed? Share your story in the comments below. Let us know about the moments when someone finally saw your worth, or when you found strength despite being overlooked. If this story touched something real inside you, please leave a like and subscribe so more voices like Maria's can find hope today. Share it with someone who needs to remember that their work matters, their dignity is unshakable, and their story deserves to be honored. For more stories that remind us of the power of human connection across all boundaries, click the link to our podcast where every voice is valued and every experience is worthy of respect. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us, for listening to Maria's truth, and for believing that people can change when they choose to see each other clearly. We'll meet again in our next story, where invisible courage becomes visible hope.